This presentation on the Irish language is part of the Irish Festival Seattle's 2021 celebrations. Hello, my name is Caoimhín de Barra and I am an Associate Professor of History at Gonzaga University. I am author of Gaeilge, A Radical Revolution, a book that was praised by one reviewer for offering a broad, fresh look at the Irish language and criticised by another for putting forward a dystopian vision on how to revive Irish. You can't win them all, I guess. In this video I'm going to talk to you about the Irish language and offer some insights on its history and its place in contemporary Irish society. The Irish language, also known as Gaeilge in Irish, or sometimes Gaelic, is an old language that has been spoken on the island of Ireland for at least 3,000 years. It was a dominant language in Ireland for most of its recorded history, but its position was undermined over time by the increasing intensity of English colonisation of the island. As a result, by 1800, scholars estimate that perhaps as few as 45% of the Irish population still spoke Irish as their first language. Ironically, the actual number of Irish speakers in Ireland increased in the first half of the 19th century, even as the percentage of the population that spoke Irish continued to fall. This was due to the enormous growth of the Irish population that took place at this time. By 1845, there were about 3 million Irish speakers in Ireland, or 38% of the Irish population. This was simultaneously the most Irish speakers there ever had been, but also the lowest percentage of the population who spoke Irish at any one time. Of course, this was on the cusp of the Irish famine, which had a devastating impact on the language. Between 1845 and 1851, over 1 million people died, and 1 million people emigrated as a result of the disease and starvation brought on by the famine. The famine disproportionately hit areas that were primarily Irish-speaking. The map on the left shows in green the parts of Ireland where Irish was still the most commonly spoken language in 1850, and the map on the right shows in red what areas suffered the most during the famine. As you can see, there was considerable overlap between the two. In 1845, there were 3 million Irish speakers. By 1851, this had fallen to 2.1 million. In other words, in the space of 6 years, 1/3 of the Irish-speaking world had disappeared. This decline continued for the rest of the 19th century, and by 1891, only about 700,000 people, or 14% of the population, still spoke Irish. The language seemed to be on the verge of extinction. However, some people decided to act to save the language. In 1893, the Gaelic League, or Conradh na Gaeilge, was formed by Douglas Hyde and Owen McNeill, two Irish language scholars. The goal of the Gaelic League was to preserve Irish where it was still the spoken language of the people, and to encourage its use in English-speaking areas. The Gaelic League was a non-political organisation, but the very nature of its mission meant that it tended to emphasise the differences between Ireland and Britain, and its philosophy inspired those who dreamed of Irish independence. This is best shown by looking at those who led the 1916 Rising in Dublin against British rule. Of the 7 men who signed the Irish Proclamation and were executed once the rebellion was defeated, 5 had been members of the Gaelic League. So it is hardly surprising that when an independent Irish state emerged in 1922, there was a desire among the leaders of the new nation to revive the use of Irish across Ireland. How was this to be achieved? Through education. By the 1930s, the study of Irish was mandatory for all elementary and high school students in Ireland. The government believed that if the people simply knew how to speak Irish, their patriotism would ensure that they would speak Irish, and the language would be widely spoken in a couple of generations. However, as anyone who has visited Ireland any time recently can tell you, that plan has largely been a failure. Which brings us to today. What is the position of the Irish language in Ireland today? Well, Irish is in an unusual position in that it is both the official language of Ireland, but also is only spoken fluently by a small minority of the population. This can lead to some linguistic quirks from time to time. For example, in 2015, a Romanian man living in Ireland who was accused of drink driving was able to have the results of a breathalyzer test thrown out as evidence against him because the results of that test were not provided in both Irish and English. On the other hand, in 2016, a native Irish speaker left his job as a barman after he and his co-worker were ordered to stop speaking Irish while they were working together behind a bar. Ireland might be the only country in the world where one can get into trouble for speaking the official national language while at work. So, how many people speak Irish in Ireland today? That question is not as simple as it might seem, because what it means to speak a language can vary from person to person. According to the 2016 census, 1.7 million people, or about 40% of the Irish population, said they could speak Irish. Now, if you were asking how many people speak Irish fluently, most would agree that that number is greatly exaggerated. However, if you asked how many people could say at least something in Irish, this number is probably too low, given that most of the Irish population study Irish at school. That same census told us that about 74,000 people, or 1.7% of the Irish population, speak Irish on a daily basis. About 185,000 people, or 4.2% of the population, said they spoke Irish on a daily or weekly basis, and we might use this as a rough estimate of what percentage of the population speak Irish fluently. Interestingly, a survey released in early 2021 found that 1.5 million people, or 28% of the population, described themselves as confident in their ability to speak Irish, while 35% were confident in their ability to understand Irish. When we talk about who speaks Irish, it should be noted that there are parts of Ireland where, officially at least, the government recognises that Irish is more widely spoken. This is known as the Gaeltacht, and you can see in the map the areas in green that are official Gaeltacht regions. These were the last corners of Ireland where Irish was still the spoken language of the majority of people when the state was founded. But as the boundaries have not changed in a long time, large parts of these Gaeltacht regions are now primarily English speaking. The 2016 census found that only about 20,000 people, or 21% of the Gaeltacht population, speak Irish on a daily basis. In other words, over 70% of the people who say they speak Irish on a daily basis actually live outside of the Gaeltacht. The Irish government has always found itself in a bit of a catch-22 situation when it comes to the Gaeltacht. These regions tend to be poorer, more rural and less economically developed than other parts of Ireland, which has led to increasing depopulation. But in trying to tackle these economic issues, the government has often helped attract people who don't speak Irish to the Gaeltacht, which only puts further pressure on the language there. Some scholars are concerned that Irish will disappear as a community language in any part of the Gaeltacht within the next couple of decades. But wait a minute, I hear you say. If everyone studies Irish all the way through elementary and high school education, how come it isn't more widely spoken? After all, that is 13 years of learning Irish. Ask any Irish person and they will tell you it is because Irish is taught badly at school. I would argue, however, the issue is that we have completely unrealistic expectations about what can be achieved in teaching Irish as a school subject. The things we learn best at school are precisely the things that are reinforced in wider society once students leave the classroom. Because students never encounter Irish outside of class, they struggle to retain it. Teaching people a language in class without students having the opportunity to put these language skills to use outside of class is basically equivalent to teaching people to swim on dry land. I can speak from some experience on this. I am raising my two children through Irish in Spokane, Washington. We have a bilingual household where I only speak Irish to them and my wife speaks English to them. My eldest is now 5 and she understands everything I say to her. But because she often can speak English back to me, she doesn't have the same need to speak Irish, and she is far less confident in her spoken Irish. The point is that if someone who perfectly understands Irish and who hears the language all day every day finds it a bit challenging to speak Irish, then why would we expect people who learn it in a classroom for 40 minutes a day to become fluent speakers? It should also be noted that the Irish language can be the source of some debate in modern Ireland. While surveys consistently show that a large majority of Irish people have positive views of the language and are in favour of state support of the language, there is an outspoken minority who have quite critical opinions on the language. Most of the arguments they put forward suggest too much money is spent on Irish or too much time is dedicated to teaching Irish. And while on the surface these might seem like reasonable opinions to hold, most Irish speakers will tell you that there is a level of vitriol directed towards Irish speakers that goes beyond a simple difference of opinion about state spending or education. Indeed, a few years ago, I got into an online debate with someone who made a video about the Irish language and said they wanted a, quote, reasonable debate about the language. By the end, as you can see here, this person said they wanted to shoot me dead and put me 6 feet under. So much for being reasonable. I just want to share one quote from a man named Declan Lynch, who was a columnist for one of Ireland's leading newspapers. In 2009, he wrote an article where, as you can see, he equated the speaking of Irish to the inflicting of sexual or psychological abuse. I certainly have no problem with anyone who has a different opinion from my own about the importance of Irish, but I think this quote shows that there is a disturbing contempt among a minority of Irish people towards the language. So, what about the future of Irish? One of the most exciting developments for the Irish language over the last 30 years has been the rise of the Gaelscoil, or the Irish Language Immersion School. While there has always been some Irish language immersion education since the foundation of the state, the number of these schools has risen steadily in recent decades. In 1972, there were 11 Gaelscoileanna outside the Gaeltacht. By 2017, there were 145 such schools. And if one includes schools in the Gaeltacht and Northern Ireland, today there are over 300 schools educating their students through the Irish language. While these numbers are still relatively small, with only about 8% of Irish children educated through Irish, there is a growing demand for them. In fact, these schools are often oversubscribed, and the common complaint is that there are not enough places available in these schools for parents who would like to send their children there. One recent survey found that half of Irish parents would like to send their children to an Irish language school if that option were available in their area. I know most of you can't read this headline, so you're just going to take my word that that is what it says. So while the Irish language undeniably faces considerable challenges in its future, I think the growth of these Irish immersion schools gives good grounds for confidence about what lies ahead for Irish. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Lá Éile Pádraig Son Díobse, or Happy St. Patrick's Day to you all.